Whether you're mixing or mastering, it's important to understand how the audio signal flows through a Cubase channel. Let's look at the different channel types that pertain to this audio signal flow. They include audio tracks and their associated channels, instruments, samplers, group, and effects channels, as well as input channels and the master output channel. So to get an idea of how the signal flows through a channel, let's look at this bass track. And you'll notice that there's a little E right here. That's the Edit Channel Settings button. When you click on that, it will reveal the channel settings window. And it's important to understand how the signal flows from within this window, because it can get a little bit tricky. You can also get to this window from inside of the Mix Console or any version of the Mix Console by clicking the same E button. Let's reveal the Mix Console in the lower zone and find that channel that we were going to be editing, which is right here, the clean bass channel, and click the Edit button right here. That reveals the exact same channel settings window. So there are multiple different ways to get to it. Now, the way to think about the channel settings is this is where the signal flows from the recorded track. In other words, if I were to close this window and looked at this audio event, where does the sound go after it's recorded? Well, it goes into the channel settings window. But specifically, it doesn't come into the channel fader. Most people think that this is where the sound comes in. Actually, the fader is where the sound flows out after you process the signal through all of the different effects that you can find here in the channel settings window. The recorded signal actually comes into the pre-section. The pre-section you'll find in the equalizer tab. And that may seem a little strange that why does the signal come into the equalizer first? Well, it doesn't actually come into the full EQ, it just comes in through the pre-settings. And the reason that it's in the equalizer is because it has a low cut and high cut filter, as well as the invert phase button and the pre-gain. The pre-gain control allows you to alter how much signal is coming into the channel itself. So if you have a really hot signal, you may need to back off the channel gain. Or if it's a weak signal, you could increase the gain coming into the channel here as well. Then it flows through the low cut and high cut filters. Then it normally flows from the pre-section into the insert slots, but you can change how the signal flows through either the inserts or the strip, and I'll explain that in a moment, but let's talk about the inserts. There are 16 insert slots inside of any audio-based channel in Cubase, and you'll notice that there's this little green delineator. This allows you to alter how many of those inserts are pre-fader and how many you have post-fader. In other words, if I were to drag that green control down here to the bottom above the last two slots, you'll see that the insert slot before the delineator is pre-fader, which means that the signal will flow through these insert slots before it gets to the fader itself. Then it flows out of the fader and then can go through the post-fader slots. So 15 and 16 here are post-fader. And the insert slots are where you add most of your dynamic processes. You can add spatial effects here, but I'll explain why that can be a little problematic a little bit later. But at any rate, this is how the signal flows through the inserts. It starts at the first slot, then comes out of the first slot, goes into the second slot, and so forth. So just as an example, if I were to add a dynamics processor here, like a compressor, and then added a time-based effect, like a delay. Let's go with the stereo delay here. The signal is going to flow from the pre-section into the first insert slot, then out of the first slot, and into the inputs of the second populated slot, or the next populated slot. So the signal flows top to bottom until it gets to the last populated insert slot. And I'm going to close these effect control panels right here. The signal then flows from the last populated slot into the strip effects. Strip effects are things like gates, compressors, the position of the EQ, which I'll talk about in just a moment, other tools, saturation effects, and a limiter. And you'll notice that there's not only a channel strip tab here, but a separate one here. The effects that you see in the strip are the same as they are here in the channel strip. They're just different ways of looking at it, as well as how you position them. So, for example, if I wanted the compressor to come after the equalizer, then I can just click and drag those around. I can do the same thing over here in the strip tab. So the representations between the two are the same. The advantage in looking at them in the strip window is that you have presets for each of the different types of effect processors, whereas you can't get to the presets here in the channel strip. But what you can do in the channel strip settings on this tab are adjust the controls themselves. For example, if we loaded a noise gate and then a compressor, then it's going to feed from the last insert to the noise gate through the vintage compressor, then into the equalizer, then it's going to flow out of the equalizer into the tools, the saturation effects, and the limiter. But what if you wanted the channel strip effects to come first, before the insert slots? For example, if I wanted to put the saturation effects very first in line, and I wanted the recorded signal to flow through Magneto 2, the tape saturation effect, first before it goes through the other insert slots. That's what this little button is for. This moves the channel strip in front of the inserts. So now the recorded signal will flow through the strip and go through all of those effects, then come out of the limiter and go into the first populated insert slot. Then after it flows out of the equalizer, it will go through the channel strip and through the tools and the limiter. If we have the strip set before the inserts, then the signal will flow out of the limiter in through the very last populated slot. Then it gets tapped off of either this last slot or the limiter, depending on how you have them positioned, into the send effects, which we don't have any assigned right now, so that's why they're empty. But the full signal from the very last populated slot or the limiter will go into the fader itself. Then it flows out of the fader and in through the last post-fader insert slots. And then the signal will flow out of the channel itself and go either to the stereo output bus, or if you have those channels assigned to their own groups, like I did previously, then the signal is going to flow into the groups and kind of follow that left to right output until it finally gets to the stereo output fader. And next I'll talk about the 4 basic mixing treatments.